Robert Maxwell was 52 years old, a lifetime built with his own hands, and he woke up one May morning unaware that by the end of that day he would have nothing left. The company he'd spent 23 years building was sealed shut with a court order. His wife packed her bags. His friends vanished, and the city that once applauded him began to whisper his name as a synonym for failure. But what no one saw coming, not even he, was that amidst all of it, in a small, damp apartment kitchen, a woman with graying hair and calloused hands was silently guarding the only secret capable of changing everything. Stay until the end, because this story will surprise you. The Cook's Secret. That May morning arrived with an unseasonable chill for Springfield, Illinois. A dry cold, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter, unsure if the discomfort comes from the air or from deep within your chest. Robert Maxwell left his house at 7:20 a.m., as he had done every day for more than 2 decades. Tie adjusted, shoes polished, the same firm stride of a man who believes the world is exactly where it should be. That was Rob, a man who was never late, who never left a bill unpaid, who never admitted weakness. 52 years old, with distinguished grey at his temples, broad shoulders that carried the weight of a company built brick by brick since he was 29. Robert Maxwell was, for most people in Springfield, synonymous with hard work, honor, and prosperity. That's why, when he turned the corner onto Lincoln Avenue and saw the yellow caution tape stretched across the gate of his distribution warehouse, the world seemed to stop. It wasn't just any tape. It was an official court seal, and there were 2 men in dark suits standing on the sidewalk, briefcases in hand and expressions that left no doubt about what was happening. Rob parked his car slowly, as if the delay could postpone the inevitable. He got out. He walked toward the gate with his hands in his pockets, and one of the men approached him before he even reached the other side of the sidewalk. "Are you Robert Maxwell?" He answered yes, his voice not yet trembling. What happened in the next 40 minutes remained etched in Rob's memory as a series of disconnected images. A paper with many numbers, a red stamp, Charles Davis's name cited in at least 3 different clauses, and the physical, almost visceral sensation that the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. The distribution company had been seized for debts he was unaware of in their true magnitude. Contracts signed in the company's name without his knowledge. Suppliers registered that he had never seen. A web of irregularities that, according to the documents, had been constructed for at least 4 years. 4 years. While he worked 12, 14 hours a day, while he slept soundly, believing his partner handled the financial side with the same seriousness he handled clients, Chuck Davis had been slowly destroying everything from within, with the patience of someone who knows they won't be discovered anytime soon. Rob didn't call anyone at that moment. He stood outside the company that had been his life until 9 in the morning, when employees began to arrive and found their boss standing on the sidewalk, staring at nothing. Some asked what had happened. He didn't answer. He got into his car, closed the door, and sat there for another hour, without starting the engine. Charles Davis, 58, had been his partner for 11 years. They had met at a regional agricultural expo in Peoria, when both were still too young to know how much the world could disappoint. Chuck was a man of serene appearance, always well-cut hair, an easy smile, the kind of person who walks into a room and makes everyone feel comfortable. He was good in meetings, good with clients, good at making people believe in him. Rob had trusted him blindly, and that trust, which seemed to be the foundation of everything, had revealed itself to be the greatest trap. In the weeks that followed, Rob contacted lawyers, tried to negotiate with creditors, tried to understand the extent of the damage. What he gradually discovered was worse than he imagined. The distribution company was insolvent. The debts far exceeded what had been built. The office would be vacated. The luxury sedan he had financed in the company's name would be repossessed. And the house, the spacious corner house where he had lived for the past 15 years with Beth, was also compromised, as part of the collateral for one of the loans had been registered against it without his knowledge. Beth Maxwell was 49, the daughter of a moderately successful local farmer, and had grown up knowing the value of things, but also the weight of comfort. She wasn't a cruel woman, but she also wasn't a woman prepared for adversity. When the news of the real situation reached her, through a conversation with the lawyer Rob had hired, the silence between them at dinner that night was heavier than any argument could be. In the days that followed, Beth began to leave earlier and come home later. Their conversations grew short, her glances evasive. Rob saw everything but said nothing, because the stubborn pride that had built his company also prevented him from asking for help, from admitting he was scared, from recognizing that he didn't know what to do. In less than 2 months he had lost the office, the car, the house, and was settled in a 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights, the simplest part of town, where the exterior stucco peeled in patches and the next-door neighbor had a habit of playing loud music after 10 at night. The apartment smelled of mildew and stale paint. The windows were small, and true sunlight only entered through one of them, early in the morning before 9. It was Doris, Rob's sister-in-law, Beth's younger sister, who hired the cook. Doris was a practical woman, the kind who doesn't ask if you want help. She simply helps. She knew Rob wasn't eating properly, that the apartment was devoid of food and life, and that her brother-in-law's pride would never let him ask for help. So she acted on her own, as she always did, and appeared one afternoon with a woman by her side. "She starts Monday," Doris announced, leaving no room for argument. "You don't have to do anything. Just stay out of her way." The woman beside her was small, her grey hair pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun, wearing an apron she'd brought from home, as if she already knew she was hired. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders slightly stooped from years leaning over stoves and sinks, and her dark eyes met his without flinching. "Naomi Carter," she said, extending her hand. Robert shook it automatically, without truly looking at her. He thanked his sister-in-law with a nod, closed the door as soon as they left, and went to the apartment's smaller window, the one that didn't catch the sun, and stared down at the street for a time he couldn't have measured. Naomi was 61 and had arrived in Springfield from Prairie Creek, a small town just over 50 miles away, where she had been born, raised, and spent most of her life. But her story didn't begin and end in kitchens. For 14 years, between the ages of 32 and 46, Naomi had worked as an administrative assistant at the Riverbend Agribusiness Co-op in Prairie Creek. It was a medium-sized cooperative that brought together rural producers from 3 different counties, and where Naomi had learned, practically and in detail, how the money in regional agribusiness worked. She knew how to read balance sheets. She knew how to identify inconsistencies in cash flows. She knew what it meant when a vendor appeared in the system with an unfamiliar business registration or an out-of-state address without a history of deliveries. She had left the co-op after her husband fell ill, and she needed to dedicate herself to him full-time. After he passed, she returned to the job market, but the world had changed, and administrative positions for women over 50 were unfairly scarce. So she returned to what she also did very well: cooking. And in it, she had found a dignity that no one could take from her. The following Monday, she arrived at 8 in the morning with a canvas bag on her arm and the keys Doris had sent via text message. The apartment door was closed, but there was light under the threshold. She knocked twice, waited, and when no one opened, she used the key carefully, like someone entering a house that isn't their own and respects that. Robert was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. He looked at her as if he had completely forgotten she existed. "Good morning," Naomi said, without ceremony. "Please make yourself at home. I won't bother you." He didn't respond. He picked up the cup, took it to the sink, poured the coffee out, and left the apartment with his briefcase under his arm. Naomi looked at the dirty sink, the almost empty refrigerator, the stove with dried grease on the burners, and placed her bag on the counter with the calm of someone who has all the time in the world. In the following days, she learned the topography of that apartment in the quietest way possible. She knew what time Robert left, what time he returned, when he needed absolute silence, and when he stood in the hallway talking on the phone in a tense voice that tried to sound controlled. She didn't intrude on the conversations. She left his plate covered with plastic wrap in the refrigerator when he came home late, prepared coffee before leaving, so he only had to turn on the stove in the morning, and never asked anything. But she listened. It wasn't intentional eavesdropping, it wasn't prying. It was simply that small apartments don't keep secrets, and Naomi was present during the hours Robert forgot someone else was there. She heard the numbers he cited to his lawyer. She heard Chuck's name pronounced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She heard the legal terms the lawyer used and that Robert repeated to himself afterward, as if he were trying to quickly learn a new language. And inside that head that had spent 14 years processing financial information for an agricultural cooperative, the pieces began to fit together in a way that Robert, enveloped in pain and wounded pride, still couldn't clearly see. There was something wrong with the scheme the lawyer described. Not wrong in the sense of unfair, but wrong in the technical accounting sense, the kind of error that leaves a trail because whoever devises the scheme believes no one will look closely enough at the minute details. Naomi had seen this before. She had seen it at the co-op years ago when a purchasing manager had done something similar for almost 2 years before being discovered. The pattern was recognizable to anyone who knew where to look. She didn't say anything yet. It wasn't the time. She had tried once, just once, to mention that she had noticed something in the papers Robert left scattered on the kitchen table after his calls, documents he opened, looked at with eyes red from exhaustion, and left there as if he didn't have the strength to put them away. She had approached carefully and said, in the most neutral voice she could manage, that she had noticed something that seemed inconsistent. Robert had turned to her with a look she would never forget. It wasn't exactly anger. It was that mix of humiliation and arrogance men accustomed to being powerful felt when they perceived someone smaller in the hierarchy they constructed in their minds, trying to intrude on what they considered their exclusive domain. "Thank you, Naomi," he said, with a dryness that stung more than a shout. "But my business affairs are not your concern." She nodded, turned to the stove, and continued stirring the rice in silence. But she didn't stop observing, and she didn't stop taking notes. She carried a simple, black-covered notebook in her canvas bag. It was the same type of notebook she had used at the co-op to record inconsistencies before taking them to her supervisor. She had learned that memory fails, that time distorts, that the only thing that sustains an accusation is paper. So she wrote names, dates, figures she managed to catch from conversations, names of companies cited by Robert's lawyer, details that, isolated, meant nothing, but together began to form a picture she recognized very well. She didn't know yet if the day would come when she could use that notebook, but she knew she needed to be prepared for when that day arrived. And in the meantime, she cooked. She made perfectly cooked rice, beans seasoned with a bay leaf she'd planted in a small pot on the living room windowsill without asking permission, chicken marinated overnight for flavor. Small things. Things that cost nothing and are worth everything when life is shattered. Robert came home late that Thursday. It was almost 11 at night when the key turned in the lock. Naomi had already left, but the plate was covered in the refrigerator. The note beside it simply read, "Heat for 15 minutes on low heat." He stood in front of the refrigerator for a moment, hand on the handle, and then slowly opened it. He ate alone at the kitchen table, listening to the street noise below, without turning on the television. And it was that night, as he chewed in silence, that a message from Beth arrived on his phone. Short, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. She was asking for a divorce. Robert slowly placed his fork on the table, stared at the wall opposite him, and remained that way for a time he couldn't measure. The food grew cold. The street below continued to hum with noise, and he, who had built everything alone and was losing everything alone, understood in that moment that the worst was still to come. And the cook's secret. The word divorce carries a specific weight that no other word can imitate. It's not just the end of a marriage. It's the end of an entire version of oneself, that version that believed it was enough, that believed it had built something solid enough to last. Robert stared at that message on his phone for so long that the screen darkened on its own, and he didn't even notice. When he came back to himself, the food was completely cold, and the kitchen had become silent in a way that seemed deliberate, as if even the street noise knew this wasn't the moment. He didn't reply to Beth's message that night, nor the next morning. He woke before the sun, sat on the edge of the bed for a long time staring at the floor, and then got up with the same automatism as always, made the coffee Naomi had prepared for him the day before, and left the house before 7. It was Friday, and he had a meeting with his lawyer at 9. The lawyer's name was Gary Nelson, 56, a lean man with a measured voice who had been recommended by a mutual friend and who, from their first meeting, had treated Robert with that mix of respect and pity people reserve for those who have lost something great. Gary was competent but overly cautious, the kind who prefers to state the worst to avoid having to apologize later. In recent weeks, each meeting with him had left Robert heavier than the last. "The asset situation is concluded," Gary said that morning, opening a folder on the table with precise movements. "The house has been formally notified. The eviction period is 60 days, but given that Ms. Maxwell is still in the property, the situation needs to be handled carefully." Robert listened without interrupting. He had learned to do that in recent weeks. Listen, absorb, not show what he felt. It was the same mechanism he had used for years in distributor negotiations, that ability to maintain a neutral face while everything boiled inside. Only before, he used it to win. Now he used it to survive. "What about Chuck?" he asked when Gary paused. The lawyer tapped his fingertips together on the table. "Chuck has hired Marcus Ferndale," he said, with a tone that indicated the name should mean something. And it did. Marcus Ferndale was the most expensive lawyer in the state, known for turning simple arguments into cases that dragged on for years. He's going to contest everything. Their strategy is to present you as co-responsible for the irregularities. They'll try to show you knew. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," Gary said, with a patience that had a genuine kindness beneath it. "But proving it is different from knowing." Robert left the meeting with his head heavier than when he'd entered. He walked slowly along the sidewalk of Main Street, past the bakery where he'd had coffee for years, past the newsstand where the owner greeted him by name, past the pharmacy where everyone knew his wife. Springfield was a town that had embraced him while he was great, and he felt in that moment how conditional that embrace was. There were the glances. There were the whispers that stopped when he approached. News of the distributor's closure had spread through town with the speed only painful subjects achieve in small communities. And the version circulating, fueled by whom he wasn't sure but suspected, was that Robert had been negligent, that he had allowed the company to be destroyed by his own incompetence. Chuck's name appeared in conversations as a supporting player, never as the primary culprit. This hurt in a different way. Deeper. That afternoon he arrived at the apartment earlier than usual. Naomi was still there, cutting vegetables on the counter, her back to the door. She heard the key in the lock, heard the footsteps in the entryway, and continued cutting without turning, as she always did, respecting the space he didn't ask for but needed. Robert tossed his briefcase onto the living room chair, loosened his tie, and went to the smaller window. He stood there staring at the street for a long time. Outside, 2 children played on the sidewalk with a rubber ball, and a man swept the front of the bar across the street with that slowness of someone in no hurry to finish what they started. The city moved on, indifferent to what had collapsed inside that apartment. "There's coffee," Naomi said without turning. "I made it earlier because I imagined you might come home before." He didn't respond immediately. After a moment, he said, "A thank you," so low she barely heard it. But she heard. In the days that followed, something subtly changed in the apartment. It wasn't a change that could be easily named, but it was real. Robert started arriving at less predictable times, which meant Naomi was sometimes still there when he got home. And in these brief encounters, which never lasted more than a few minutes before one of them left the room, a kind of silent familiarity began to settle. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't trust. It was simply the involuntary intimacy that happens when 2 strangers inhabit the same cramped space for long enough. Robert began leaving documents on the kitchen table with less care to hide them. It wasn't permission. It was just the weariness of maintaining the appearance of control over everything at once. And Naomi, who saw those papers every morning as she prepared coffee and organized the counter, continued taking notes. Discreetly, with the small, neat handwriting of someone who learned to save paper as a child. The notebook had grown thicker. There were now several pages covered with observations, names, approximate values, dates. There was a list of company names that appeared repeatedly in Robert's phone conversations with the lawyer, companies that Naomi had mentally cross-referenced and that, by coincidence or not, had names very similar to surnames of people she knew, from fragmented conversations to be distant relatives of Chuck Davis. It was the same pattern, And it was that night, as he chewed in silence, that a message from Beth arrived on his phone. Short, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. She was asking for a divorce. Robert slowly placed his fork on the table, stared at the wall opposite him, and remained that way for a time he couldn't measure. The food grew cold. The street below continued to hum with noise, and he, who had built everything alone and was losing everything alone, understood in that moment that the worst was still to come. The cook's secret. It was almost identical to what she had seen at the co-op years ago, when the purchasing manager set up shell companies in the names of brothers-in-law and cousins living in another state. She needed someone who knew how to turn those notes into something usable, someone from the financial world, who understood the language of numbers the right way. She had a person in mind, but it wasn't time to contact them yet. First, she needed to be more certain of what she had collected. It was on a grey Tuesday, with a fine drizzle that made the sidewalks slick, that Robert's divorce became public in a way he hadn't foreseen. Beth had given an informal interview to the local newspaper's Society column, one of those columns that pretend to talk about social life but actually thrive on exposing what people would prefer to keep private. It hadn't been a planned interview, Naomi later learned from Doris, but it had been a lunch conversation that ended up in print. The note said that Beth Maxwell was beginning a new chapter, that she had distanced herself from situations that didn't align with the lifestyle she had built, and that she was doing very well, surrounded by supportive people. Robert's name wasn't mentioned directly, but the entire town knew what it was about. And the implicit message for anyone who wanted to read it was clear. She was getting out before the shipwreck dragged her down, too. Doris called Robert as soon as the newspaper edition circulated. He didn't answer. She called again. No answer. She went personally to the apartment that afternoon and found Naomi in the kitchen and Robert sitting at the table with the newspaper folded in front of him, his face set in a way that seemed carved from stone. "Robert," Doris said, her voice firm, trying not to cry. "You need to get out of this apartment. You need to see people. You need—" "I'm fine," he said. He wasn't. Naomi knew he wasn't. Doris knew he wasn't, and he probably knew himself. But pride was a wall he had built so high over a lifetime that now he no longer knew how to dismantle it, even if he wanted to. Doris stayed for an hour. She drank the coffee Naomi prepared without being asked, talked about practical things, about a family lawyer who could help with the divorce, about a smaller property she had seen available for rent in case the apartment needed to be changed. Robert listened and responded in monosyllables. When she left, he stared at the closed door for a moment and then went to the bedroom. Naomi washed the cups, dried the stove, organized what needed organizing, and before leaving, passed by the kitchen table to pick up her bag. Robert's documents were there, slightly out of place, as if he had flipped through them and dropped them. She saw in the corner of one of the pages a name that hadn't appeared before, Phoenix Distribution and Trade, with a business ID from Valleywood. She didn't touch the papers, but she memorized the name with the care of someone who knows she will need it later. That week, Robert stopped eating properly. Naomi began to find him every morning sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee getting cold in the cup, his gaze lost on some point of the wall that had nothing interesting to offer. She started leaving cookies on the table, small things he could eat without needing an appetite. And one day, without making any comment, she left chicken noodle soup with carrots in the refrigerator, the kind that takes time and patience to make well, with the chicken shredded at the right time and the broth reduced until it was thick and golden. He ate all the soup that night, and the next morning, for the first time in weeks, the coffee was gone from the cup before it got cold. Naomi noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. It was on a Thursday afternoon that she took the first concrete step regarding the notebook. She had left Robert's apartment earlier than usual and went to a payphone downtown, one of those that still worked and which she preferred for calls that needed privacy. She dialed a number she had memorized, waited for 3 rings, and when a voice answered on the other end, she simply said, "Valerie, it's Naomi. I need a favor." It's not a small one. Valerie Seeger was 58 and had been Naomi's colleague at the Riverbend Agribusiness Co-op for almost a decade. She was a certified accountant but had retired early after a health issue and now lived in Prairie Creek, where she helped her son with a small neighborhood accounting firm. She was discreet, competent, and owed Naomi an old favor, the kind that never expires. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Naomi explained what she had observed, the names she had noted, the pattern she had recognized. Valerie listened in silence, asked 2 precise questions, and then was quiet for a moment. "Do you think they're shell vendors?" she asked. "I think it's more than one," Naomi replied. Another silence. "Send me what you've got written down," Valerie said. "Not all at once. Go slow. I need to see if the pattern holds before I say anything more." Naomi thanked her, hung up, and stood beside the payphone for a moment, feeling the cold May wind sweep the sidewalk and kick up dust in the gutters. The city around her continued its rhythm. Cars passed, people walked. The smell of wet earth, characteristic of that time of year in Springfield, hung in the air with that familiarity of something that doesn't change. She adjusted her apron inside her bag, lifted her chin, and began to walk back to the bus stop. It wasn't time yet to say anything to Robert. He wasn't ready to listen, and she knew, with the wisdom of someone who had lived over 6 decades learning to read people, that forcing the right moment too soon was the quickest way to waste everything she had built with patience. But the moment would come. She was sure of it. What she didn't know yet was that, before that moment, Robert would sink much deeper than he already was, and that the fall, when it truly came, would be of a kind that no notebook alone could cushion. The cook's secret. June arrived with a deceptive dry heat. The Springfield sky turned white during the day, that thin veil white that promised no rain but also delivered no true sun, and the nights suddenly grew cold, as if the day had been a lie that the cold came to undo as soon as the sun disappeared. It was a month of contrasts, and Robert lived within them without realizing, so entangled in himself that he had stopped noticing the world outside with any detail that wasn't purely functional. The preliminary hearing for the lawsuit was scheduled for the 2nd week of June. Gary had warned him in advance, explained what would be discussed, and prepared Robert for what might happen. But preparing someone for public humiliation isn't the same as protecting them. They are different things, and Robert discovered this in the worst possible way on the morning he entered the courthouse and saw Charles Davis sitting on the other side of the room with his lawyer, Marcus Ferndale, beside him. Chuck was well dressed, hair neatly cut, a dark suit of expensive fabric, that slight smirk Robert had taken years to learn to read and now recognized with a clarity that stung. It was the smile of someone comfortable, unafraid, who had arrived at the right place with the right tools. Chuck looked at Robert as he entered, and for a second they locked eyes. Then Chuck looked away with an indifference that was more offensive than any words could have been. The hearing lasted less than 2 hours, but it felt much longer. Marcus Ferndale was exactly what his reputation promised, a man of precise speech who used legal vocabulary like a precision weapon, placing words in the right spot to create impressions that were later difficult to undo. He presented documents, many documents, and what these documents suggested, with the carefully constructed ambiguity of someone who knew what they were doing, was that Robert had been at minimum negligent in the company's administration and at maximum complicit in the irregularities. Gary contested what he could. But there were gaps in Robert's defense, gaps that stemmed from the very absence of sufficient counter-documents, and Marcus Ferndale found these gaps with the ease of someone who had already mapped the terrain before entering the field. When they left the courthouse, Gary placed a hand on Robert's shoulder in the hallway and said, in his usual measured voice, "It wasn't good, but it wasn't the end either. We need more time and more material." Robert nodded, said nothing. He walked to his car, got in, closed the door, and stared at the windshield for a long time without starting the engine. That afternoon, when he arrived at the apartment, Naomi was tidying up the last things before leaving. She saw his expression as soon as he entered, that stone-like face that hid too much, and said nothing. She placed the last pot on the shelf, picked up her bag, and as she passed him toward the door, she paused for a second. "There's soup in the fridge," she said. "Pumpkin ginger. It's good for a tough day." He didn't respond, but when she left and closed the door behind her, he went straight to the refrigerator. The news that destroyed what remained of Robert's reputation in Springfield arrived on a Monday morning, without warning, In the cowardly way bad news often arrives when you are least prepared. The local newspaper, the same one that had published the note about Beth weeks earlier, featured a story about the lawsuit in its main column. The article was bylined, had unidentified sources, and presented the version of events that Chuck's lawyer had begun to build at the hearing, the version in which Robert was at least partially responsible for the distributor's irregularities. There were numbers cited with surgical precision. There were mentions of specific contracts. And there was in the last paragraph a sentence Robert read 3 times before he could absorb it. That sources close to the case claimed Robert had been informed about the financial inconsistencies months before the collapse and had chosen not to act. It was a lie. It was a lie constructed with fragments of truth twisted in the right direction to seem plausible, but Springfield didn't know that. Springfield read the newspaper and believed, because it was easier to believe than to investigate, because the powerful always fall for some reason, and because the narrative of a businessman who knew and stayed quiet was far more satisfying than that of a man who was simply betrayed. Robert's phone began to receive messages even before 8 in the morning. Some were from people who were still on his side, few expressing solidarity with the restrained language of those who don't quite know what to say. Most were silence, that silence of contacts who stop responding, of people who stop greeting, of a world that quietly closes its doors without making a sound, so as not to have to explain why. Doris called furious. Not furious with Robert, furious with the situation, with the newspaper, with Chuck, with everything that had spiraled out of control in a way she couldn't fix with her usual practicality. She wanted to act, wanted to call the newspaper, wanted to write a rebuttal, wanted to do something that felt like a fight. Robert calmed her with the empty voice of someone who no longer has the energy to fuel others' anger besides his own. "Leave it, Doris," he said. "It won't help." "Yes, it will," she replied, her voice choked. "It won't help," he repeated, and he hung up. That week, Robert rarely left the apartment. He cancelled 2 meetings with Gary, responded to messages late, and spent his days between the window that didn't catch the sun and the kitchen table, with documents spread before him that he looked at but couldn't truly process. His gaze had changed quality. Before, it was the gaze of a man trying to solve a problem. Now, it was the gaze of a man who was beginning to doubt if the problem had a solution. Naomi saw this every day. She saw the forgotten coffee cup. She saw the plate she left in the refrigerator returned half-eaten the next morning. She saw the documents that changed places but not tables, circling around as if he read and reread them without being able to extract anything different from what he already knew. She had received a response from Valerie the previous week. The accountant had analyzed the names and patterns Naomi had described, and her conclusion had been cautious but consistent. There were indeed indications that the companies cited could be shell companies, but to make this usable in a lawsuit, it would be necessary to cross-reference with physical documents, not just information from memory. Valerie had stated clearly, without paper, there's no argument. With paper, there's everything. Naomi looked at the documents scattered on Robert's kitchen table and knew that the evidence was there, or at least part of it. But she couldn't simply take the man's papers. She needed him to let her in, and for that, she needed him to be ready. That moment arrived in a way she hadn't planned. It was a Wednesday morning, early. They embraced with the familiarity of those who hadn't seen each other in years, but knew their friendship had survived time without needing maintenance. They walked to Robert's apartment, because it was close and because Naomi had thought it best not to draw attention to the visit. No cars, no comments to anyone. Robert was waiting for them, seated at the kitchen table, documents organized for the first time in weeks, Naomi's notebook open in the center of the table. He had spent the previous 2 days rereading the notes and separating from everything he had on hand the papers that seemed most relevant. It was the first time since the distributor's closure that he had done something that felt like action instead of reaction, and this had subtly but visibly changed something in him. His shoulders were a little less stooped, his gaze a little less dim. Valerie sat down, opened the folder she had brought, and for the next hour it was the strangest meeting Robert had ever participated in his professional life. There was no formal agenda, no PowerPoint, none of the structures he had learned to associate with serious meetings. There was a retired accountant, a cook in an apron, and a bankrupt businessman sitting around a small kitchen table, and the three spoke about numbers with a seriousness that didn't need a sophisticated setting to be real. Valerie analyzed what Naomi had noted with an attention Robert had never received, not even from the best consultants he had hired over the years. She asked short, precise questions, and when Robert answered, she jotted it down with a blue pen on a graph paper pad that seemed to have come straight out of the 80s. Sometimes she would pause, push up her glasses, and stare at a specific point in Naomi's notebook for a time that seemed disproportionate to the size of the annotation. Phoenix Distribution and Trade, she finally said without preamble. The business ID is from 2018. The company has registered activity, a website, everything, but the registered address is a commercial office space in Valleywood that I know from other cases. It's the same address as 4 other companies that have appeared in phantom vendor schemes in the region. Robert remained still. You know that address? He asked. I know the pattern, she replied. Those who set up this kind of structure don't invent addresses from scratch. They reuse them. It's cheaper and harder to trace because the address itself is real. It's just what operates within it that doesn't exist. She pushed up her glasses. If I can cross-reference the invoices this company issued to your distributor with the delivery records you had, and if those deliveries don't exist, we'll have our lead. But for that, I need the physical records of merchandise receipt. Do you have them? Robert thought. There was a folder stored at the house of a former employee named Evan, which contained physical copies of all the distributors receiving receipts from the last 5 years. He had asked Evan to keep them when the office was sealed, more by instinct than by strategy, unaware at the time that such an automatic gesture could be important. I do, he said. Valerie nodded, not smiling, but with an expression that conveyed good news. Naomi, who had been silent for almost the entire meeting, got up to get the coffee she had made earlier and placed a cup in front of each of them without being asked. It was a small gesture, but there was a kind of anchor in it. Something concrete and warm at a time when everything else seemed abstract and uncertain. Valerie stayed in Springfield for 2 days. During that time, she and Robert went to Evan's house to retrieve the folder of receipts, brought everything back to the apartment, and spent an entire afternoon cross-referencing the documents with Naomi's notebook entries. Evan Quinn was 54, had worked at the distributor for 17 years as the head of receiving, and was one of the few employees who had remained loyal to Robert after the collapse, not out of self-interest, but because there was an old loyalty between them, built over years of working side by side. When Evan understood what was being sought, he pulled from memory details that weren't on any paper. He said that he had noticed, on at least 3 occasions, invoices for incoming goods that didn't correspond to any physical delivery he had recorded in the warehouse. He had questioned it at the time, had been informed it was a system error, and had let it go because it wasn't his place to question the accounting. I should have insisted, he said, with a guilt that wasn't his, but that he carried nonetheless. No, Robert said, with a firmness that surprised them both. You did what anyone would do. It's not your fault. It was the first time Robert had said the word fault aloud since the beginning of everything, and there was in that word, when it finally came out, a small but real release, like untying a knot that had been tight for too long. Valerie left on the morning of the 3rd day with the folder of documents and a detailed list of what she needed to verify. She told Robert it would take at least 2 weeks to cross-reference everything, that she couldn't promise anything yet, but that what she had seen had enough substance to justify the effort. Before leaving, she turned to Naomi in the hallway and said, with that direct manner that was her trademark, "You did well to call." Naomi simply nodded. Chuck Davis's reaction came a week later, without warning, and with a precision only possible when someone has information they shouldn't. Gary Nelson called Robert on a Monday afternoon with a voice different from usual, that voice of someone holding something unpleasant and looking for the best way to release it. Chuck has presented new documents, he said. Documents alleging you had knowledge of the financial irregularities for at least 2 years before the collapse. They're internal company emails, Robert, with your name in the recipient field. Robert was silent for a moment. Those emails don't exist, he said. I know you say that, Gary responded, with a careful choice of words that Robert didn't like. But they were presented with digital signatures and date stamps. They'll require forensic analysis to contest, and forensic analysis takes time and costs money. Money. The word dropped into the apartment like a stone thrown into still water. Robert had little money. He had enough to pay the apartment rent and basic expenses for a few more months, but legal fees had consumed a significant portion of what was left after everything. Forensic analysis of digital documents was a cost he hadn't anticipated and couldn't cover. He hung up the phone and stood in the hallway for a long time. From the kitchen, the smell of garlic sautéing drifted in, and he heard the sound of the wooden spoon hitting the side of the pan, that rhythmic, everyday sound Naomi produced without thinking, like breathing. He walked into the kitchen. She was facing away from him, stirring something on the stove. "He found out what I was doing," he said, without preamble. The way he spoke to Naomi had changed in recent weeks. It wasn't intimacy exactly, but something close to it. That frankness that appears when a person realizes they no longer have the energy to maintain a performance. "Chuck," she said without turning. It wasn't a correction, just a way of naming what he had stated incompletely. "Chuck," he confirmed. "He presented fake emails trying to implicate me in the scheme, and I need a forensic analysis to contest them." "An analysis I can't afford." Naomi lowered the heat, placed the spoon on its rest, and turned to him. She looked at him for a moment with that expression he had learned to recognize. It wasn't pity, not consternation. It was the way of someone processing a problem with the seriousness it deserved before saying anything. "How much time do you have before the next hearing?" she asked. 6 weeks. She nodded slowly. "There's something you don't know about me," she said. And then she paused. A pause he didn't interrupt, because he had learned that her pauses always had a continuation. "When my husband got sick, I had to sell the house we had in Prairie Creek to pay for his treatment. When he passed, something was left over. Not much. But it was there. I put it in a fund because I didn't know what to do with it, and didn't want to spend it without reason." Robert looked at her, not understanding where she was going with this. "I'm not asking for money," he said, with a rigidity that was more a reflex than intention. "I know you're not," she replied. "I'm telling you there's a possibility. I'm not offering you anything yet. I'm saying that when Valerie confirms what she thinks she'll confirm, and when you're sure this is the way, there might be a way to cover the cost of the forensic analysis without you having to sell what you no longer have to sell." There was a long silence. The rice simmered quietly in the pot. "Why would you do that?" he asked. And there was something genuinely unanswered in his voice. It wasn't provocation. It was a real question from a man who had learned in the worst possible way that people always have a motive. Naomi looked at him with an expression he would take time to interpret completely. "Because I've seen this before," she said. "I saw an honest man destroyed by a dishonest one while everyone stood by and watched. This time I know how it works. And I won't stand by and watch again." Robert didn't respond. He turned to the small window, the one that didn't catch the sun, and stared at the street below for a moment. When he turned back, she had already resumed cooking. The spoon returned to its previous rhythm, and the smell of garlic had transformed into something fuller, rounder, the scent of a meal getting ready. He went to the table, sat down, and stayed there until dinner was ready for the first time since she had started working for him. Normally, she would leave his plate covered and go home before he arrived. But that night, neither of them moved to end it. And when she placed the plate in front of him and went to serve her own, sitting on the other side of the table, neither of them commented on the fact that it was the first time they had eaten together. They ate in silence. But it was a silence different from all the others that had inhabited that apartment in previous weeks. It was the silence of two people who had arrived, each by their own path full of losses, at an understanding that didn't need words to be real. Outside, the Springfield night continued with its usual noises, the neighbors' music, a dog barking in the distance, the wind rustling the treetops on the sidewalk below. And inside that small, damp apartment, which had been the scene of so much heavy silence in recent weeks, there was now something that resembled, from a distance and with care, the possibility of a fresh start. It was 3 days later that Valerie called. Robert was in the living room when the phone rang, and he heard by the tone of her voice, even before understanding the words, that she had found what she was looking for. "Robert," she said, "I need you to call your lawyer today. Because what I have here isn't just a lead, it's the whole rope. And then, before he could respond, she added something he didn't expect, something that would completely change the direction of what was to come, and that would make Chuck Davis's name carry a much greater weight than any of them had imagined until that moment. The cook's secret. What Valerie had found couldn't be conveyed in a phone call. She said this clearly right after the sentence that had left Robert speechless, and asked him to go to Prairie Creek the next day, in person, with his lawyer if possible. Robert hung up the phone, stood in the middle of the living room for a moment, and then went to the kitchen where Naomi was putting away the last pots of the day. "Valerie found something," he said. She stopped what she was doing and turned to him. She didn't ask what. She waited. "She wants me to go to Prairie Creek tomorrow, with Gary." Naomi nodded slowly, like someone processing not just the information but its weight. "Will you go?" she asked. "I will," he replied. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard in months. It wasn't euphoria, not certainty. It was determination. That specific quality of voice that appears when a person who has been stuck for a long time finally decides to take a step, not because they know it will succeed, but because they know they can't stay still. He called Gary that same night. The lawyer listened in silence, asked 2 practical questions, and said he would be available to go to Prairie Creek the next day, provided the meeting was before noon. They arranged to meet at 9 in the morning at Valerie's house. That night, Robert didn't sleep well, but it was an insomnia different from previous nights. Before, sleepless nights were filled with that kind of circular thinking that leads nowhere. The same numbers spinning, the same images of the sealed gate, the same sensation of the ground disappearing. This time, there was a direction. There was a direction to his thoughts, even if that destination was still uncertain. Valerie's house in Prairie Creek was small, with a white facade and green windows, surrounded by a garden she clearly tended with care. A mango tree in the backyard rustled gently in the warm morning breeze, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the open door before anyone even stepped inside. Valerie received them with an air of objective efficiency. She served coffee, placed a folder on the living room table, and without more preamble than necessary, began to explain what she had found. There was not 1, but 6 distinct business IDs linked to Robert's distributors' vendors that exhibited the same pattern: shared registered addresses, a lack of verifiable physical delivery records, and invoices issued on dates that systematically coincided with periods when the distributor recorded its highest sales volumes. The scheme had been set up to dilute the diverted funds into transactions small enough not to attract individual attention, but which, summed over 4 years, represented a significant amount. Gary listened with the attention of someone recalibrating a series of internal calculations. He had been working under the premise that there were irregularities, but the extent of what Valerie presented was significantly greater than what had been documented so far. "The problem remains the same," he said when Valerie finished the first part of her explanation. Proving Robert didn't know, the emails Chuck presented. "About the emails," Valerie interrupted him, with a calm that had the specific quality of someone saving the best for the right moment. "I have a nephew who works in systems analysis in Chicago. He's not a forensic expert, but he knows enough to identify inconsistencies in digital file metadata. I asked him to look at the copies Robert had of the company's original emails, the ones that were actually sent during that period." She opened a second compartment of the folder. "The emails Chuck presented have creation metadata that doesn't match the dates in the message body. Someone edited them afterward and didn't do it carefully enough." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences that had filled the past few months. It was the silence of when a missing piece appears and suddenly the entire picture becomes clear. Gary picked up the documents Valerie had separated, read them slowly, pushed up his glasses, which he also habitually wore, and finally placed the papers on the table with a precision that indicated he had made a decision. "This is enough to request a judicial forensic analysis of the emails," he said. "If the analysis confirms what you're showing me here, their strategy collapses. And with the cross-referencing of the phantom business IDs, we go from defense to offense." He looked at Robert. "But the cost of the analysis—" "It's covered," Robert said. Gary looked up at him with an expression of slight surprise. "It's covered," Robert repeated with firmness. He didn't explain how. Gary didn't ask. Back in Springfield, Robert entered his apartment late that afternoon and found Naomi still there, which was unusual for that time. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in front of her, and she looked up when he came in. He said nothing. He pulled out the chair on the other side of the table, sat down, and stared at her cup for a moment. "I need to ask you something," he finally said. And the difficulty in that sentence was visible, almost physical, the difficulty of a man who had spent his entire life asking nothing of anyone. "What you mentioned about the fund you had left. I need a loan. It's not a small amount, and I can't guarantee a specific repayment schedule." Naomi listened to him without blinking. "How much?" she asked. He stated the amount. She showed no reaction to the number. "All right," she said. "Naomi," he said, with a low urgency that was the closest he came to overt emotion. "You understand this is a real risk, that it might not—" "I understand," she interrupted him, with a softness that wasn't naivete. "I'm not a child, Robert. I know what I'm doing." He stared at her for a moment. There was something in her eyes that he had taken a long time to learn to read, a serenity that didn't come from carelessness, but from a different relationship with risk. The relationship of someone who had already lost important things and had discovered they survived nonetheless. "Why do you trust me?" he asked. It was the second time he had asked a similar question, but this time it carried a different weight. It wasn't skepticism. It was something close to a real need to understand. Naomi thought before answering. She placed her cup on the table, clasped her hands over the checkered tablecloth she had placed there weeks earlier without asking permission, and said, "I don't trust everyone, but I know how to read people. I take my time, I observe, and when I decide a person is honest, I truly trust them." A pause. "You're stubborn, proud, sometimes difficult to deal with, but you're honest. I saw that from the beginning." He didn't respond. He looked away towards the small window, the one that didn't catch the sun, and stayed that way for a while. When he turned back, she saw something in his eyes that had been absent for months. Not joy, not relief, but a kind of humanity that long suffering sometimes covers up without the person realizing. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple word, but the way it came out said much more than the word contained. The weeks that followed were the most tense since the beginning of everything. Gary filed the request for forensic analysis, presented the documents Valerie had compiled to the court, and requested the technical analysis of the contested emails. Chuck's lawyer, Marcus Ferndale, responded with a series of objections that delayed the process for more than 2 weeks, each one designed to create procedural obstacles that would consume time and wear down the opposing party. Robert followed everything closely, but there was something different in how he faced the delays now. Before, each new obstacle was a blow that pushed him deeper. Now there was a different kind of restraint, not resignation, but the patience of someone holding a trump card and knowing the moment to play it will come. On one of those waiting days, Evan showed up at the apartment with a box he had kept at home without mentioning it to anyone. There was a destination for his thoughts, even if that destination was still uncertain. Valerie's house in Prairie Creek was small, with a white facade and green windows, surrounded by a garden she clearly tended with care. A mango tree in the backyard rustled gently in the warm morning breeze, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the open door before anyone even stepped inside. Valerie received them with an air of objective efficiency. She served coffee, placed a folder on the living room table, and without more preamble than necessary, began to explain what she had found. There was not one, but 6 distinct business IDs linked to Robert's distributors' vendors that exhibited the same pattern: shared registered addresses, a lack of verifiable physical delivery records, and invoices issued on dates that systematically coincided with periods when the distributor recorded its highest sales volumes. The scheme had been set up to dilute the diverted funds into transactions small enough not to attract individual attention, but which, summed over 4 years, represented a significant amount. Gary listened with the attention of someone recalibrating a series of internal calculations. He had been working under the premise that there were irregularities, but the extent of what Valerie presented was significantly greater than what had been documented so far. "The problem remains the same," he said when Valerie finished the first part of her explanation. Proving Robert didn't know, the emails Chuck presented. About the emails, Valerie interrupted him, with a calm that had the specific quality of someone saving the best for the right moment. I have a nephew who works in systems analysis in Chicago. He's not a forensic expert, but he knows enough to identify inconsistencies in digital file metadata. I asked him to look at the copies Robert had of the company's original emails, the ones that were actually sent during that period. She opened a second compartment of the folder. The emails Chuck presented have creation metadata that doesn't match the dates in the message body. Someone edited them afterward and didn't do it carefully enough. The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences that had filled the past few months. It was the silence of when a missing piece appears and suddenly the entire picture becomes clear. Gary picked up the documents Valerie had separated, read them slowly, pushed up his glasses, which he also habitually wore, and finally placed the papers on the table with a precision that indicated he had made a decision. "This is enough to request a judicial forensic analysis of the emails," he said. "If the analysis confirms what you're showing me here, their strategy collapses. And with the cross-referencing of the phantom business IDs, we go from defense to offense." He looked at Robert. "But the cost of the analysis—" "It's covered," Robert said. Gary looked up at him with an expression of slight surprise. "It's covered," Robert repeated with firmness. He didn't explain how. Gary didn't ask. Back in Springfield, Robert entered his apartment late that afternoon and found Naomi still there, which was unusual for that time. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in front of her, and she looked up when he came in. He said nothing. He pulled out the chair on the other side of the table, sat down, and stared at her cup for a moment. "I need to ask you something," he finally said. And the difficulty in that sentence was visible, almost physical, the difficulty of a man who had spent his entire life asking nothing of anyone. "What you mentioned about the fund you had left. I need a loan. It's not a small amount, and I can't guarantee a specific repayment schedule." Naomi listened to him without blinking. "How much?" she asked. He stated the amount. She showed no reaction to the number. "All right," she said. "Naomi," he said, with a low urgency that was the closest he came to overt emotion. "You understand this is a real risk, that it might not—" "I understand," she interrupted him, with a softness that wasn't naivete. "I'm not a child, Robert. I know what I'm doing." He stared at her for a moment. There was something in her eyes that he had taken a long time to learn to read. A serenity that didn't come from carelessness, but from a different relationship with risk, the relationship of someone who had already lost important things and had discovered they survived nonetheless. "Why do you trust me?" he asked. It was the second time he had asked a similar question, but this time it carried a different weight. It wasn't skepticism. It was something close to a real need to understand. Naomi thought before answering. She placed her cup on the table, clasped her hands over the checkered tablecloth she had placed there weeks earlier without asking permission, and said, "I don't trust everyone, but I know how to read people. I take my time, I observe, and when I decide a person is honest, I truly trust them." A pause. "You're stubborn, proud, sometimes difficult to deal with. But you're honest. I saw that from the beginning." He didn't respond. He looked away towards the small window, the one that didn't catch the sun, and stayed that way for a while. When he turned back, she saw something in his eyes that had been absent for months. Not joy, not relief, but a kind of humanity that long suffering sometimes covers up without the person realizing. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple word, but the way it came out said much more than the word contained. The weeks that followed were the most tense since the beginning of everything. Gary filed the request for forensic analysis, presented the documents Valerie had compiled to the court, and requested the technical analysis of the contested emails. Chuck's lawyer, Marcus Ferndale, responded with a series of objections that delayed the process for more than 2 weeks, each one designed to create procedural obstacles that would consume time and wear down the opposing party. Robert followed everything closely, but there was something different in how he faced the delays now. Before, each new obstacle was a blow that pushed him deeper. Now there was a different kind of restraint, not resignation, but the patience of someone holding a trump card and knowing the moment to play it will come. On one of those waiting days, Evans showed up at the apartment with a box he had kept at home without mentioning it to anyone. Gary then presented the cross-referencing of the phantom business IDs, Evans' receipts, Roger's trail to Chuck's cousin Al's company, and the systematic pattern of embezzlement over 4 years that Valerie had documented with the precision of someone who had spent decades working with numbers that don't forgive inaccuracy. It was a body of evidence that, alone, would have been enough to sustain the action. But there was still one last piece, the one Doris had saved for the end of the call, the one that involved the name Robert hadn't pronounced aloud even once since the beginning of everything. Beth. It wasn't what Naomi had imagined. It wasn't a revelation about the marriage. It wasn't a betrayal in the sense the word carries when speaking of a couple. It was something different, and in a way heavier than any personal betrayal could be. In the months that followed the distributor's collapse, while Robert was sinking in the small apartment trying to survive, Beth had approached Charles Davis, not romantically, pragmatically. She had accepted, according to documents that Robert's lawyer had managed to gather through a source at the county recorder's office in Chicago, a transfer of funds to an account in her name made in 2 installments in the months immediately preceding the formal divorce. The amounts weren't large enough to constitute complicity in the main scheme, but they were large enough to explain the speed with which she had left, the indifference with which she had spoken to the newspaper, and the silence she had maintained about everything she knew about her husband's company. She had been paid to leave without asking questions, and she had accepted. Naomi stood in silence for a moment after Doris finished telling this part. The garlic on the stove had burned, and she turned off the heat without thinking, mechanically, as she processed what she had heard. "How is Robert?" she asked. Doris took a second to respond. "Quiet," she said. "You know how he is. But quiet in a different way than before. It's not the quiet of someone sinking. It's the quiet of someone processing." Naomi nodded to herself. "He'll be here soon," she said. "I'll be here." She hung up the phone, placed it on the counter, and stood for a moment looking at the turned-off stove. Then she restarted dinner from scratch, because the garlic had burned and because there was something right about starting from scratch at that specific moment, on that specific day. Robert arrived at the apartment at 5 in the afternoon. Naomi heard the key in the lock and continued cutting the tomato without turning. He entered, placed his briefcase on the living room chair as he always did, and walked into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her back. "You already know," he said. It wasn't a question. "Doris called," she replied, without stopping what she was doing. He entered the kitchen, pulled out a chair and sat down. He stared at the table for a while. Naomi finished cutting the tomato, washed her hands, and sat on the other side. "Beth," he said, in a voice that held no anger. It held weariness, and beneath the weariness was something that felt almost like relief, the strange relief of finally understanding something that had been confusing for a long time. "I should have seen it." "Nobody sees what they don't want to see," Naomi said, with a simplicity that wasn't judgment. He was quiet. Then he said, "You saw." "I had nothing to lose by seeing," she replied. "It's easier to see when you're on the outside." There was a long silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because it has its own substance. Outside, the September sun in Springfield had begun to gild the treetops on the street below, that late afternoon light that transforms everything into something slightly more beautiful than it is during the day. The smell of fresh tomato mixed with the apartment's old scent created a combination that was, strangely, comforting. "The lawsuit isn't over," he finally said. "The verdict could still take months." "I know," she replied, "and even when it comes out, what I recover won't be what it was before." "It rarely is," she said, "but it doesn't always have to be." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had learned to recognize over the months, that expression of a man who was learning, slowly and at great cost, to receive what was offered to him without turning it into debt or weakness. "Why did you stay?" he asked. It was a different question from those he had asked before. It wasn't skepticism, not distrust. It was genuine. "You could have left. Anyone would have left." Naomi thought before answering with her usual care. When I was young, back in Prairie Creek, my father had an expression he used when we wanted to give up on something halfway through. He'd say, "The seed doesn't see the tree." She paused for a moment. "I planted something here. I wasn't leaving before seeing if it grew." Robert stared at her for a while. Then, for the first time in all the months she had worked for him, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, not euphoric. It was small, real, the kind that appears when a person wasn't planning to smile, but it happened anyway. "You are a very strange person, Naomi Carter," he said. "I know," she replied, with the same slight smirk she had given alone in the kitchen months earlier, when she had found the chicken noodle soup container empty and washed in the refrigerator. The verdict came in November, 2 months after the September hearing. These were 2 months of waiting that Robert endured differently from everything he had experienced before in the process. There was a structure now, a direction, and even if the outcome wasn't guaranteed, the feeling of acting instead of just resisting had changed something fundamental in how the days passed. He had started going out more, reconnected with some people from his distributor days who had remained discreetly present, not many, but the ones who mattered. He had had coffee one morning with an old client who had called to express solidarity after reading a note in the same newspaper that had published the article against him. This time, a note about the case's developments that put the facts in a different perspective. He had even one October afternoon passed by the building where the distributor had been and looked at the gate without feeling the same weight as before. It was different. It wasn't indifference. It was distance, and there was an important difference between the two things. Naomi continued coming every morning. The dynamic, however, had shifted organically, without either of them needing to name the change. He made coffee sometimes. She would arrive and find the kitchen table organized. There were conversations still short, but real, not just information exchanged about the lawsuit or the day's meal. Conversations about Prairie Creek, about her work at the co-op, about a nephew of hers who had gotten into college, about the neighborhood that was getting a new park. Small things, the kind of things that build, brick by brick, what is most solid between people. The verdict arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, via a call from Gary at 8:45. Robert was at the kitchen table when the phone rang, and Naomi was at the stove. He answered, listened in silence, said, "Understood," 3 times, and hung up. He held the phone in his hand for a moment. Charles Davis had been ordered to reimburse Robert for the full amount of the proven embezzlements, adjusted for inflation, plus punitive damages set by the judge due to the fabrication of the emails, which had been treated as an aggravating factor. The total amount didn't restore the 23 years Robert had built. No number could do that. But it was enough. Enough to pay Naomi back with interest she had never asked for, enough to rent a smaller commercial space and restart on a different scale, enough for the new beginning to be real and not just symbolic. Naomi heard the silence that followed the call and turned off the stove. She turned slowly. Robert still held the phone, staring at the table. When he looked up at her, there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen at any point in the preceding months, not in the worst nights, nor in the moments when he had begun to pick himself up. It was something that only appears when a very long journey finally reaches the other shore, and the person stops and looks back and understands, all at once, how far they have come. "It's out," he said. She nodded slowly. "In our favor," he added. She nodded again. Robert placed the phone on the table, stood up, and remained still for a moment in the middle of the small kitchen of that damp apartment that had been the setting for one of the hardest phases of his life. Then he walked to the smaller window, the one that never caught the sun, and stared down at the street. Naomi stayed where she was, respecting that moment that belonged to him. After a time she didn't measure. He turned to her and said, "I never learned your name properly." "In the first few months, I passed you every day and barely looked." "I know," she said without accusation. "Naomi Carter," he said, with a deliberation that had nothing of ceremony and everything of realness, as if he were saying the name for the first time truly, not as a mere record, but as a person. "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment. There was so much she could say. There were months of history in that apartment. There was the black-covered notebook. There were the calls from the payphone. There was the money she had lent without a second thought. There were all the mornings and all the plates covered with plastic wrap, and all the coffees that had grown cold, and all the ones that hadn't. There was the memory of another honest man, years ago, whom she hadn't been able to save. There was so much. But she only said, "The seed doesn't see the tree," and then she returned to the stove. In the months that followed, Robert began to set up what would be a smaller, leaner company, without a partner this time. He rented a warehouse on the east side of town, hired 4 people, including Evan, who had accepted immediately with a loyalty that surprised no one who knew him. The fresh start was slow and required a humility that the Robert of 2 years prior wouldn't have been able to sustain, but the Robert who had endured those 18 months had learned, in the hardest and truest way possible, that the size of a company doesn't define the size of the person who builds it. Naomi continued working for him for a few more months, until he had the company in a condition to operate with some regularity, and she decided, with the calmness of someone completing a task that had begun with purpose, that it was time to go. There was no drama in her departure. There was only the mutual recognition that what had been planted there had grown enough to stand on its own. On her last day of work, Robert arrived early and had prepared coffee. The table was set, there was fresh bread he had gotten from the corner bakery, and there was an envelope on the table beside her cup. She opened the envelope. It was the amount she had lent, with an adjustment he had calculated himself, and which was more generous than anything she would have asked for. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." She put the envelope in her canvas bag, drank her coffee, ate her bread, and when she left that morning and descended the stairs of the apartment that had been the stage for everything, she felt, with each step left behind, the lightness of someone who had fulfilled what she set out to do, not what she had been hired for, but what she had decided to do on her own, guided by the memory of another time, and by the certainty, firm as her calloused hands, that this time she had made a difference. Upstairs, Robert stood at the smaller window, the one that never caught the sun, and watched Naomi leave the building's gate and walk down the sidewalk towards the bus stop, with her canvas bag on her arm and her tight bun in its usual place. She didn't look up, but he stayed there until she turned the corner and disappeared, and only then did he turn back to the kitchen, to the table with the cup still on the checkered tablecloth she had placed there months ago without asking permission. And he felt, with a clarity that needed no words, that that small, damp apartment had been, without him realizing it while it was happening, the place where he had learned the difference between building alone and building with someone by his side. It wasn't the same life as before. It never would be. But it was a real life, rebuilt brick by brick on a foundation that this time he knew what it was made of. Not just hard work and pride, but also gratitude, and a black-covered notebook he had kept in the kitchen table drawer and would never throw away. Outside, Springfield continued at its own pace, a town that knew its own, with the smell of damp earth that the wind carried from the prairie on November mornings, with the sun beginning to hit directly at that hour, entering the small window for the first time in a long time. For the first time in a long time, Robert did not turn away from the light.